Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham. Welcome to Season 5 of Energy vs. Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's climate and energy challenges, highlighting the Canadian context. Today's show isn't live, but most of ours are, so subscribe to EBC emails at energyversusclimate.com to get invites to our webinars and in-person shows. We've got a lot of great content coming for you this season, starting with today's talk with Dr. Melanie Thomas. Melanie is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary. Her research investigates the politics of energy transition in Canada, from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy, with the aim of developing potential solutions that strengthen our democratic politics. On today's show, we dove into Melanie's survey research into Albertans' attitudes to the energy transition, the oil and gas industry, coal, and climate change. David wasn't able to join us for this one, but he'll be back live for episode 2. Now let's get to it. Melanie Thomas, thanks for joining Sarah and me on Energy versus Climate.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So you and your colleagues have conducted research through survey work into the attitudes of Albertans toward energy transition, but also, by extension, climate change and the oil and gas industry in particular. And before we get to your findings, perhaps you could start by explaining a bit about the methodology behind the survey, when you conducted it, or surveys, when you conducted it, the sample size, how you collected the data. And since attitudinal polling and surveying have been a little beat up of late, maybe you could also talk about your confidence level in your methodology when you extrapolate from the survey's results.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that because that's the bread and butter of a lot of the work that I do. So I always twinge a bit when somebody says you've done a poll. When they say Melanie did a poll, I was like, I did not do a poll. This is not what I'm doing. And I like no shade to good polls, but academic surveys, really what we're doing is that we're looking at verified indicators. So the measures that we use, lots of the ones that we put a lot of confidence in are things that have been developed and established and honed over time, and they've been tested over time. They've been tested in multiple contexts. And so we have a really better degree of confidence that we are measuring what we think we are measuring than what I would expect in the typical public opinion poll. I know when I've been an academic consultant on various sorts of things where what's happening is polling that's being informed by research. As researchers, we would consistently say, we would measure these things in different ways, usually using more questions. And the response that we get back is, yes, but that makes it expensive. And we don't think that we get much purchase off of like doing it the way that you do it. So we'll just conflate some of these indicators with like the other concepts that we're interested in. And we're like, okay, well, that's not how we do the job, but that's because we're not pollsters, right? And so for me, I would see the survey, like a really good academic survey is one where you're able to get at the sincere views of regular folks. And so in order to be able to do that, you have to, like I say, have really good questions that actually map onto the concepts that you need to care about based on the existing literature. And then you need to be able to access a sample that's going to give you a reasonable estimate of the population that you want to generalize back to. And so for us, one of the things that we know in Canada is that it can be challenging to get a really reliable provincial sample. So we can come up with census estimates and do the math in the background to figure out just how many people we need to sample to be able to generalize to all Canadians. But we also know that if there are enough differences or enough variations in those census things that we care about across provinces and within provinces, that if we only have a national sample, we really can't disaggregate and generalize down. So one of the things I always want to watch for is if I have lots of good individual level data, I'm much more comfortable aggregating up to a generalization. I start to get real nervous if I've got national level stuff and I want to generalize down to the individual level. To me, that's ecological fallacy. I don't like doing it. The assumptions that I have to make to be able to go from like the aggregate down to the individual are ones I'm not prepared to make. I would much rather assume, if I had to assume in one direction, it was like I've got good individual information and I can make some assumptions with some adjustments based on census measures to be able to generalize up to kind of collective opinion. And so because we wanted to start this looking in Alberta, we figured the most up-to-date pool that we could sample from was going to be those who consented to participate in the 2019 Vote Compass. This is through Vox Pops Labs. They have political scientists who and others who are academically trained to the doctoral level who kind of like help them help run that particular part of the business. And so we designed the survey. We designed all of the things that we wanted to access and like the sampling parameter and all these other sorts of things. And we tasked them with being able to set it out to their pool of Albertans immediately following the 2019 election, thinking that that was going to be the most up-to-date, biggest pool that we could access. And we accessed that because we wanted to have a really big sample, because we ran a series of survey experiments in this as well. And so the key to being able to do that work really well is that you need power. And to get power, you need a big sample. And so we did our power calculation and then we like blew over it with our sample because we wanted to be able to have power to disaggregate, to be able to see, well, what's going on with women, what's going on with other groups, what's going on with partisan dimensions. So we wanted to be able to retain power enough at a disaggregated level so we have a far larger sample than what we would need if we just wanted to generalize to Albertans in general, because we wanted to take into account the complexity and the moving parts of things.
Yeah, just thinking now that we've come recently through another provincial election here in 2023, I guess a two-parter question. A, has there been similar sort of immediate follow-up surveying work done in the aftermath of our most recent election? And then the second one is, looking back, so now that survey was done in 2019, coming back to your confidence level, what's your confidence in the results being reflective today, given that it's a survey that's 4 years old now?
So I am confident that we have a good description of what was going on in 2019.
Fair enough.
Which I would take that as an important context for things that would be happening now. So one of the things I would want to look at is, because how we talk about energy transition has changed over the past 4 years. It's become politicized in ways that it wasn't in 2019. And so I feel like we've got a reasonable baseline and then we can see how things change over time. We have another data collection that we did in December 2020, where we replicate what was done in Alberta, but we extended it to British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec. We treat those provinces like they're countries, which means we have a full sample that's of a sufficient size that we can generalize about the province, but then also do those kinds of population breakdown analyses like we want to do here. I would say the top line finding that I think folks find most surprising. There are several surprising findings in this study, I think. But the one that I think most people go like, oh, that really runs contrary to stereotype, is that a majority of Albertans support explicitly moving away from fossil fuels. And so we separate out how people feel about moving away from fossil fuels from how people feel about moving towards renewables. A number of environmental organizations, and specifically the Alberta Narratives Project, had done focus group work where folk had said that they see renewables sometimes, or a common view is that, like, what a nice add-on. So people were warm and positive towards renewables, but in ways that didn't necessarily cue that they thought that they could, that suggested that these were kind of like a linear spectrum where you've got fossil fuels on one side and renewables on the other, that it was kind of like a both and. And I think if you speak to lots of folks, this idea that there's going to be this like both and as part of the energy mix is an accurate reflection of what things might look like for quite some time, right? So that's why we separated out those two. And in general, when we ask folks about this, and we have a multifaceted measure, people have to feel really strongly about oil and gas being like the most important thing. And they have to feel really strongly about wanting the market and the economy to look in a particular kind of way, to be convinced to be tipped over to be on balance opposed to transition. What's really striking to me is just the overall high levels of support. What it means is that there's very few things that we find that actually push people up or are associated with people being more likely to support transition. And I think that's a ceiling effect in the statistics. Like there isn't a lot of variation for folks to be able to go higher in lots of ways. And so contrary to stereotype, especially for folks who are outside of Alberta, it's there's the rhetoric that comes from a certain kind of political elite that is messaging about this particular topic in a way that is primarily serving partisan interests. That's how I read lots of the communications. When we look at how like people think about this in this province, though, lots of people are like, yeah, no, like I'm okay with moving away from oil and gas, or I agree, we need to do it. Thus framed, it makes lots of things in Alberta play a little bit differently than what they would if we're just using the stereotype to filter how we're interacting with the content.
Yeah, I remember your paper said that the two strongest predictors of support for energy transition are those pessimistic predictions on the future of the oil and gas industry, but correlated or corresponding with that, a high level of concern about climate change. Maybe just Sarah, curious, two things. One is you're a colleague of Melanie's at the University of Calgary, so it'd be neat to hear just of the intersection between your work there, School of Public Policy, and the Masters of Environmental Design program, and Melanie's. But then the second one is with those kind of the top line findings. When you read the paper, did you find that surprising, or was that intuitive for you?
Yeah, we'll start with the first one and just say briefly, I mean, I've gotten a chance now to work with Melanie on a new project that we have that's in the space related to carbon removal technologies funded by ECCC. And I think there's some really exciting things that are starting to happen more and more in the university around really this like making transdisciplinarity or whatever the buzzword of the day is more real in terms of actually having people collaborate and work together. So, but coming to this point of, the question of how the future of the industry looks being so important for, the support and transition away from it. I mean, I thought it was really interesting and really, I guess, jumped out at me, as you say in the work about how that is so important for people's opinions. And it puts, I think, some of the rhetoric and dialogue in a new light, or at least sort of makes some sense to me of the very strong pushback that we get towards, as you start to have more and more organizations like the International Energy Agency and others that are really, coming out with different scenarios that show, a likely peak and decline in demand for fossil fuels and what that means for the future. And there's, is a lot of pushback on that. And I guess that makes sense in the context of, if people really start to believe that, then that support for the transition away from oil and gas becomes more significant. I think the other part that, is really interesting, and I think you started to explain it, and I'd love to hear more about it, is like, how do you square this majority support with the political dialogue that we hear, and how much is that also to do with sort of, I sometimes feel, and again, this is a sort of very naive view, but it sometimes feels like in Alberta, we can have more honest conversations about our future when it's sort of just Albertans talking to each other. And then when it's like the federal government that comes or someone else that comes and says, you need to do this, there is this tendency to like push back on that and like, well, you stay out of it. Like, don't tell us what to do. So I'm curious about how that might play in.
Yeah. So I grew up on a grain farm in southwestern Alberta, a dryland grain farm, actually. So it's one of these things where I know with farmers, they might be skeptical of climate change, but they can document with precision how the weather has changed over decades, right? Like my dad will talk about how when he first immigrated to Canada, you would get you'd get an east wind, and then 2 days later you'd get an inch of rain, which is like part of me. I remember him telling me this, and I was like, we don't get east winds, Dad. Like, that's just not a thing that happens anymore. And so, like, I say that because I suspect that some of the ways that I will characterize Alberta are going to anger some folks and, like, kind of rile up the Alberta identity. So I say this, part of me is just kind of like, I'm a farmer. The address I would have to give to renew my driver's license was a land location. And, like, I know how to do orienteering well enough to be like ask questions as to why I'm locating the farm next to the relative to the fourth meridian when the fifth meridian is really right there when I'm going and doing a through hike, right? So, I mean, in that kind of context, I would say one of the things that I think I agree when you have conversations like Albertan to Albertan and like rural like rural folk to rural folk, the way that that conversation plays out, especially when when the audience is just the community, it plays very differently than even as soon as you think that there's an outsider that's come in. And so it's one thing. So just as you would say, as soon as the federal government is coming into this, and Albertans get their backs up, but like as soon as you got a city person coming in, the farmers get their backs up too, right? And so part of this is about like thinking about the kinds of things that we're prepared to say and acknowledge and like what we take as a given inside of our own communities, and then how the othering for people that might not be part of that like designated community changes what we're prepared to talk about. And so for me, one of the things that I find most limiting for Alberta are how easy it is to hit the Western alienation nerve. As if as soon as something comes from the federal level of government, by definition, it has to be something that we oppose. And like, it's one of these things where I'm also old enough to be like, I would like to see a federal government that was conservative, frankly. Like, so I keep thinking, what if Preston Manning had actually like led a party to form government while he was talking about carbon pricing as the thing that we needed to do? Like that was the 1990s Reform Party policy, right? And so you can imagine if that was like the policy innovation that was coming from a Calgary-based prime minister, what would the reaction be to it now? I also, as a political scientist, would say it pains me when the government of Alberta doesn't listen to the advice I know that they get. And so when the government of Alberta says, you're probably going to lose the charter challenge or the court case on, like, there isn't a constitutional basis that you can use to block the federal government from putting a price on carbon. Ontario got this advice and they had their plan ready to go. Saskatchewan got this advice and they got their plan ready to go. And then Premier Jason Kenney, when the decision came down as we broadly expected that it would, said, oh, we didn't anticipate that this would be the outcome. And it's like, someone in your office did though, bud. Like, so like, this is the part where like the farmer in me is kind of like, we're not stupid. And I don't like it when our provincial government acts like we are. I think it does a disservice to us. And the thing is, I know why that happens. And it's a problem that's not unique to any political party. It's a problem that's ubiquitous to government in general. And it's the short-term thinking to try to get a win. And so even the civil service is going to be thinking in terms of like a news cycle or something that is insufficiently long-term to tackle some of these problems because they want to make sure that they're actually staying on top of this kind of winning cycle. Add partisanship to that and like how a short-term win can just be sending out an email that's going to anger enough people so that your donations spike. And this is how you get lots of the rhetoric that we have now. So in looking at political communications or the news, like I have journalists from the states that call and they say, why are your people talking about this way? And it's just like, you're not the audience. The audience, I think, has to be donors because otherwise it just doesn't make sense. And so in that context, it's like we've got this rhetoric and the rhetoric doesn't match public opinion. And I think lots of folks are going through this where either they're just not paying attention to the news, which like fair. I don't hold a moralistic view on that. It's like it takes a lot of time to gather information, and lots of the information that we're getting in the news shows that people are behaving poorly, and it's frustrating to watch. And if somebody's just kind of like, I have other things to do, I'm going to go do that. I
think I would be happier if I spent less time paying attention to the news.
Yeah, no. I respect that choice 100%. Or it's just kind of like I have kids, I have busy things, I have other things to do, and I don't want to listen to this what sounds like a really stupid spat about the same things over and over and over again. Nothing is new under the sun. So if people are checked out, I get that.
If I could just jump in, Melanie, we have a recent example of, perhaps an American journalist calling up and saying, well, why did someone say that? And you said, what's part of the communication strategy? Well, I think the old Brian Mulroney quote, you dance with the one that brung you. And I think we've got a premier right now that is dancing with the ones that brought her both to be leader of her party and also premier of Alberta. And on the former, she's put this, I think, asinine moratorium on new renewable electricity development pending a outcome of a large review, which we didn't need a moratorium. And it's hard to imagine any kind of comparable moratorium ever being placed on the oil and gas industry in Alberta. But on that recent comment, Suncor CEO Rich Kruger made this comment, and now it's been picked up and broadcast, essentially saying, well, we're not doing energy transition, or we're de-emphasizing it. We're we're doubling down on our oil sands assets, and we're solidly a fossil fuel developer. And some people in Alberta, talking amongst ourselves, were inflamed with indignation at that point, until the Environment and Climate Change Minister, Stephen Guilbeault, said, well, that's why we're going to regulate your industry if you're going to back away like that. And then people are aflame with indignation at the federal government. The premier piles on. And next thing you know, we're playing right to the playbook of the current political playbook, I would say, of the UCP party. And that is to pick a fight with Ottawa and make great hay of it. But I do want to just compare and contrast the oil and gas industry in 2019 to today, and then get back to the surveys, your research's findings. If you look, like today, the industry is arguably the oil and gas industry, which I'm interested in on a terminology point, because you use oil and gas in your paper. You don't use the rebranded energy company as following the rebranding of 10 to 15 years ago. But today's oil and gas industry is in much better shape. And given the exponential growth rates that we're seeing in electric vehicles now and heat pumps, you could make a case that the long-term prospects for the industry have probably only worsened here in 2023 compared to 2019. But I'm wondering, as a starting point, is there evidence of recency bias when it comes to beliefs in the future? Might people actually have rosier outlooks about the future prospects of the industry today than they did back in 2019? Because today, the oil and gas industry, is kicking out jobs and GDP growth and has a high price of oil and gas.
So I think it would depend on where people, like what's going on in somebody's mind when they conceptualize industry. So it's not lost on me. Even thinking back past 2019 to 2015 about how we would get these media requests where it would be, how is industry, and I'm air quoting it, how is industry reacting to, say, a Conservative Party no longer being in government in Alberta? So what's the flight of capital? What's the fear about an Alberta New Democrat government? And I remember at the time it was CNRL who was saying, "Oh, we won't be able to function." There were similar kinds of comments that on the face of them really seemed to be a mismatch with what might be a more bird's eye view, dispassionate view of, say, the empirical evidence. And to me, and this is something that has, at the time, I remember thinking there's going to be a bifurcation in industry between transnational, multinational corporations, particularly ones that are used to actually having to do business in, say, Europe, and deal with European regulation, because frankly, that is, it's a level of expectation that I'm not sure that we see most places in Canada, and we certainly don't see it in Alberta, right? So there's going to be the folks who are used to doing business everywhere, and the folks who are only used to doing business here. Now, this is where Alberta gets really interesting and where political science becomes important, because there will be some folks who will be they write us when we put public facing stuff out saying, yes, I'm glad, I have been an engineer, in Alberta doing insert various kinds of work here. And you were saying the things that I have been trying to say from inside the house for quite some time. It's nice to see this being contributed to the public discourse. That's on one hand. And then on the other hand, there's the time that Andrew Scheer came to corporate Calgary to meet with quote unquote industry. And there were two reactions. One was just the looking at the list and said, who? Because the multinational players were no longer there. And then it's the kind of course, this is exactly who the industry should be, because it is a particular kind of industry or business that primarily or only functions in the Alberta context. So why would that be important? There's a couple of levels of this. One is at the public opinion level and one is at the corporate level. And we, though the public opinion bit is published in the paper that you folks read, but there's other parts of our project that deal with the more corporate side of things too. So at the public opinion level, what matters for most things is not actually having direct experience with something. It's the perception. And so I know my students struggle with this, but the way to frame it is the idea that somebody has in their head is going to be the thing that drives their behavior. This could be a poor mismatch with an empirical reality, and that doesn't matter. What matters is the idea that somebody has in their head, which is why when we ask about these things, we're really interested in self-perceptions. And so this is why, for us, the perception that oil and gas is going to be the most important industry for Alberta, even if that's not true, that perception is what drives behavior, not the truth of it. And the corresponding thing that we measure that with is the perception that Alberta is too dependent on oil and gas. And we deliberately did that because, as you know, if you look at energy broadly, it's a multifaceted, complicated industry. And if we said we're too dependent on energy, that kind of doesn't make sense. But if you say you're too dependent on oil and gas, like folk in Alberta will be like, I know exactly who you're talking about, whether or not they agree or disagree. And so one of the things that we look at with that is we talk about partisanship and polarization in terms of partisanship, and we see that on full display in the United States. And there is evidence to suggest that it's also happening in Canada. But I think you can't really understand politics in Alberta without understanding polarization in terms of how people feel about industry. If folks think that I'm picking on Alberta too much, I would say an analogous process is going to be how Quebecers feel about hydro. One of the questions that we ask is, we tell people the electrification mix, where electricity comes from in their province, and then we ask them what would you like it to be, and how quickly would you like to get there? And in Quebec is the place where this question doesn't work because it's it's all from hydro. How do you feel about that? And they're just it's very much like La Casse Populaire and all these other sorts of things. It's very much part of the Quebec identity of the Quebec state, right? But getting at your point about energy, this is where we saw and we were surprised. You can tell the pandemic derailed our publication plans because we haven't written this up in a peer-reviewed context, but we certainly have spoken about it. Albertans do not feel warm and fuzzy about coal. We presented the kind of here's your electricity mix, and you guys know there's loads of it's coming from coal. In 2019, more so than what there is now. And we're what would you like it to be? And Albertans wanted to get rid of the coal. They wanted to get rid of it by 2030. There was just kind of no emotional connection to it at all. And I remember looking at it and talking to Lori Thorlickson, who's my co-investigator up at the University of Alberta, and being kind of this isn't a fossil fuel thing. She's oh no, people are going to feel so differently about coal than what they do about the rest of it. And it could be maybe because coal was never seen to be something that filled provincial coffers, so we never had to pay taxes in Alberta. Whereas oil and gas was seen as the golden goose. And being able to be, and again, I'm probably going to anger people saying this, being able to be condescending to have-not parts of the country, to be kind of if you were as wealthy and smart as us, look at what you could be doing, neener. To New Brunswick. Part of me is just kind of why would New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, ever pay attention to any Albertan, griping about equalization when we're booming, we are so rude and condescending to the have-not parts of the country, right? Just kind of why would anybody ever want to negotiate with somebody with that kind of attitude? God.
Well, I can tell you, Sarah and I were colleagues at the Pembina Institute around this time, when the Rachel Notley government made the decision to phase out all coal-fired electricity in Alberta by 2030. And I can tell you the oil and gas executives that I was sitting around a table with negotiating at the time were only too willing to throw the coal industry under the bus as a way, partly because they knew that coal isn't fundamental to the Alberta identity the way that oil and gas is. We're not West Virginians. And knowing that generally they had the support, although Sarah and I and David hosted Dure Vino from Hanna, Alberta, who has done a lot of interesting work, and I've spent a lot of time in Hanna. If you go and on a coal town by coal town basis, sample people there, their attitudes are, of course, very different. But you had this really interesting conclusion, and it goes back to the hypothesis that, or what you've shown from your survey, that if you have a rosy outlook around the future of the oil and gas industry, your support for energy transition is less. And one factor, not the only factor, but one factor that influences that is the news that you take in. If you'd said, people had more of a steady drumbeat of negative pronouncements or announcements by companies or news media stories about those future prospects, then the rosy outlook will disappear or lessen, and then support for energy transition will go up. And you went as far as saying in a recommendation to policymakers that they should actually consider downplaying the green jobs benefits associated with energy transition. We're all going to be, turning wrenches, installing rooftop solar systems as a replacement for your work directly or indirectly in the oil and gas industry. And that they should, you said, switch the paradigm, that they should play up the risks that come from continued reliance in oil and gas. But then you also concluded by saying, well, this is sort of untested. We need further research on this. And so 4 years later, and by the way, it gets to the truism that you hear in political campaigns, right? And that is go negative. That going negative, unfortunately, it works, and every campaign goes negative. That's how you actually win a campaign. Has your hypothesis, shown to now be true 4 years later? Have you seen any Alberta politician who has sort of hammered on these risks and has maintained popularity, or anyone else?
So the caveat I want to put on this, so the one thing I would say is that the getting evidence to actually quantify or define media effects is hard. And this isn't just something that limits our ability to make a really confident knowledge claim in this space, but it kind of, anybody who's a communication scholar is just kind of we can put something in a study, and then one of the questions we'll get is, and how long do these effects last? And we have no idea, because trying to follow the same people and asking them about this a month later is prohibitively expensive, and we don't have the money to do that. We do know that negativity bias in news is real. And it's not just in terms of how news gets made, though it is very real in that. But people also, the attention that gets paid to negative news is significantly greater than to positive news. And so in that sense, I think, while I think lots of us would like to live in a world where the positive frames and the positive news would pull all the attention, I don't think that's how I would go so far as to say that's not how our brains evolved. And so it would be naive, or it's hopeful, but I think it's naive to think that there's any kind of positive message that can swamp out negative news, which also explains in terms of political campaigning why nasty Ottawa, no, I don't like this particular trio that happens to be in office. Stephen Guilbeault is so, all of that stuff. I'm rolling my eyes actively while I'm saying it, because I do find it puerile on some level. But I'm not surprised that those are effective political strategies, precisely because they're negative. Now, we wrote that, and then in our subsequent data collection, we were does the messenger matter? And we know from other research that there are times where the messenger matters, where you could change them in terms of partisan actors. If we could come up with a way to talk about energy transition where it was equally plausible that somebody like Danielle Smith and Rachel Notley could say the exact same thing, we would 100% test that. But we have not been able to come up with something that was that you could put it in the voice of those kinds of actors and actually have the same content, land with the same plausibility. What we have tested would be the things that Mark Carney has said, not just coming out of being the governor of the Bank of Canada, but being the governor of the Bank of England and saying, this is a risk that is going to affect our ability to prosper in the current economic context. I mean, so folks who are aware of what Mark Carney has said, this message is not going to be a surprise. That didn't seem to do much, which might be a little bit disheartening, but I can also point out that we tested something that was in Brett Wilson's voice to see if that would actually make folks of a particular political background, if that was
Brett
resonating.
Wilson called me an eco-terrorist, by the way, but he misspelled the word terrorist.
So that wasn't the content that we used.
He's a polemicist and a lazy speller.
Yeah. So, but we used something that was polemical of his just to see how that would play, and it also didn't land. So, as a researcher, I am cautious about this. One of the things that's surprising about the study that we published is that the news stories that we ran actually power through with effects. What's much more common is that you can put in a news type survey experiment like this, and frankly, that any effect happens is surprising. And so the results that we did find, which is that coal mining town is probably going to die due to energy transition, that this made people more supportive of transition is weird. That you can make a lot of money in solar, and that made people more likely to support energy transition. That was also unexpected. That very well could be of the moment. Like at the same time, the treatments that we've tested the most are Indigenous nations want to buy TMX. Indigenous nations are protesting Coastal GasLink. And so we play a bit fast and loose with this, where we just call them pipelines and hope folk can, like, we're just kind of curious to see what people infer with respect to a pipeline. And this, those treatments don't do a whole lot either. So the thing I would say is that, like, a single iteration of a news story, like what we present in these studies, it's the most common finding is to have no effect. And we think the reason why is that it needs to be like a drip, 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 drip. It needs to be this kind of iteration. And if you think about how the news works, it's this kind of iterated sort of thing. And so this cuts both ways. It means that if you've got somebody who's a polemicist, who's conspiratorially thinking about this, it's not necessarily going to move public opinion. But if you've got somebody who is an expert and saying the risks of climate are going to make it hard for us to be able to do anything, and the costs are going to be greater than we can bear if we don't do something, this also doesn't necessarily mean that we've got laws to do anything. But it also, like, is also the kind of thing where it's just like, if there's communications professionals listening, it's just like, we do need to get ourselves out of this idea that there's like the message that will resonate and move the needle, because like that message doesn't exist. And all the research suggests that it shouldn't. But if we were going to try it, like, it sounds cynical, but I would definitely go with a negative message. So this is where the corporate stuff is actually really interesting too. Because I'm glad that you mentioned Virginia with coal, because we look at how corporations speak about this with respect to their public-facing documents, which we know are exercises in persuasion and maybe not the most honest things. And we compare the United States and Canada and Europe, and we're looking at corporations that would be traded on like the TSX 500 or the S&P 500, like big ones. The only ones that deny the existence of climate change are the West Virginia coal firms. We've seen, like, pre and post Paris, the shifts have been for folks that actually want to deny climate change. They just don't talk about it. There is a big uptick in how firms at that level talk about risks. So you can see that somewhere that Mark Carney message is landing, and it's coming through in reports to shareholders. And this is also where, relative, Sarah, to that project that we're on, this kind of like technological optimism of like, we will be able to tech our way out of this, and we will continue to make money the way that we always expected to with this kind of like massive growth thing. That kind of framing has increased exponentially. Yeah, in ways that, and like we see that much more in Europe in the context where like the government intervention and the regulation and the expectations of disclosure is going to be, it's at a higher level than what we would see in North America. And that's where the tech optimism kicks in. But it's also striking, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say that it's also striking that like the place where it still is acceptable to be like, climate change isn't real, is for the coal firms in East Virginia. And like, not even in Alberta does that land.
We've got some even further outliers there. There were a couple of things you said that I wanted to pick up on, and then I had a question for you in a different direction. But just on that financial disclosures and kind of that, coming back to this idea that what matters is not necessarily, the objective future that the industry has, but what people believe is that objective future. I think that the financial disclosures and sort of requiring more conversation about climate, both direct climate impacts, but also climate risks through changes in, the world's demand for energy, is actually potentially really powerful in helping to shift that conversation. Because if companies are required to, as you say, go beyond sort of just a public facing, we can say what we want because it's not heavily regulated, into, we have to follow pretty strict securities rules and we can't get away with stretching the truth. I think that does create a channel for that information. At the same time, I think I'm concerned, and as interesting as the finding was about the importance of that understanding of the future potential of oil and gas, it makes a lot of sense somehow, right? If, as long as you think things are going to continue to be good and it's going to be, continue to be a wealth generator, why would you want to move away from it? And that this period of transition that we're entering into that has more, underneath it volatility will tend to confuse the conversation more, right? You're going to see prices probably rise and fall more and not this sort of smooth transition. And so it will be, I think, very confusing to understand, what's going on. And okay, why, if prices are now quite high, for example, do we think that the underlying fundamentals of, the energy system are driving towards this different one? But there was also an echo to me of, and I'll draw it back to Aostra, my favorite topic of the oil sands and the development there. And if you go back to actually Premier Lougheed's speeches at the time, his framing of why, his government was going to invest all this money in developing the oil sands was very much built around the conventional oil industry decline, right? And he says many times in his speeches, directly to the conventional oil industry people, look, like the reserves are decreasing. We're finding new reserves more slowly than we're producing. And it's really clear that this industry is going to be in decline. And so we're going to have to find something new. So I thought that was kind of an interesting similarity of, the last time we had a big, arguably, transition. The question that I wanted to ask you is one of the other findings that, I think jumped out with some of the conversations that we're having now is this idea that personal experience with climate disasters didn't have a big impact on people's attitudes. Mm-hmm. And so maybe you can say a little bit more about, first of all, am I characterizing that correctly? But also, I think we hear people saying, oh, well, now that we've had this, summer of extreme, smoke and really kind of starting to feel some of these impacts in different ways, and people's opinions are going to change. But how does that kind of square with what you found? And is there a level, at which things get so bad it starts to make a difference for people?
Yeah. So we hypothesized that being evacuated for a natural disaster might shape how people think and feel about this. But the assumption that's required for that relationship to work, or the dots that need to be connected, is that attributing the event that precipitated the evacuation back to climate change. And so this is where we found that, so in our studies, we would find the key things in Alberta are the 2013 flood, where, full disclosure, I was evacuated from that, and the Slave Lake fires in 2016. And so we asked if folks had ever been evacuated as a result of a natural disaster, and we model it statistically, and it just it doesn't power through compared to things like partisanship and things along those lines. And if I were to put this in the context of why might that be the case, I suspect it's working through levels of worry about climate change. And so one of the things that we find is that what makes people more supportive of energy transition is not believing that climate change is real, but being worried about it. So there are lots of folks who believe that it's a thing, but they don't care. In terms of the stuff that actually keeps them up at night, or will draw their attention as a problem that they would ask for an urgent solution to. It's not high on the list. What does the work is, if people are, the more worried they are about climate change, the more supportive they are of transition. And so it makes me wonder whether or not the natural disasters feed into that worry about climate change. So it's not that this isn't something that's happening, but it's actually being captured more by people's self-report about how worried they are about climate change. I have to admit, I'm so cynical. I was in Ontario when the forest fire smoke was there, and then watching all the people who clearly had not had to live through forest fire smoke. I remember sitting with my partner's cousins and being like, oh, you've got a smoke sunset. And they're like, what? Because they didn't observe it the same way we did, because we're so used to it. So, and I'm not the only one who's made the observation. It was just kind of this is the first time the East Coast has seen this. Can we tell you about the West Coast experience? I don't mean to laugh. But I also remember, I was wondering how, even Calgary's air and the quality was going to compare to, say, 2018. And we had as bad a smoke year this year as what we had in 2018. And I remember 2018 being the last time I was just kind of this is bad. This is gross. and it's pernicious and consistent. And like the thing that makes me worry about this stuff is not that I was evacuated back in 2013, but that we could have rain for days and there's still smoke in the air. It's just like the rain's not clearing the smoke anymore. It still smells like an electrical fire outside in the midst of a rainstorm. Like that's the one where I'm just like, I'm now starting to become much more anxious about this. So if I'm going to extrapolate from my personal experience to what I think I'm seeing in the data, that's what I think I'm seeing.
If I could add to that, Melanie, we've understood the science of climate change going back to the 19th century, but it's really been in the last 10 years that we're starting to see the acceleration, in particular extreme and intense weather events, even though we're just living the model, the results of the modeling. If you look back to 1990, what was predicted through the models, they're bang on, and we're just living through that right now. But I wonder if sort of that lack of correlation from your data in 2019, if it still bears out today, but if it doesn't, it could be part of the fact that, as you said with wildfires, that people just get used to a new normal. That's, the boiled frog syndrome. If you just turn up the heat in the pot in which the frog is gradually, 1C by 1C, you're not going to notice it and you're going to adjust. But then we're also seeing the effect. And I say this when we've had two terrible tragedies recently, both in Morocco, an earthquake, and Libya, flooding. And I'm not going to, for a second, try to attribute those disasters to climate change. We've talked a lot about attribution science on a show recently with paleoecologist Alison Karp. But when you look at it, one death is a tragedy. A girl, in a developing country gets stuck down a well and the world is gripped and sits on the edges of their seats for days, hoping that we get the girl out. But when you see 10,000 deaths in Libya, or you see 5,000 deaths in Morocco, that just becomes a statistic. And we're seeing that so much now that you almost become immune to it through the inundation. And I really hope that that isn't the case with the real biophysical changes and the weather changes that we're seeing in climate. But I worry, my worry about climate change, I worry that might be the case. And there might not be the strong link that your data, your research has shown that we need to have in order to really drive the kind of political coalition and bipartisan support that we need to really enact the policies necessary to try to do something about climate change.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I think help explain why we see some of the stuff that you've pointed up there. So in addition to like news having this negativity bias to it, there's also a recency bias. We also know that for issues where everybody kind of agrees that it's a good thing for us to have them, all you need to do is to get disagreement on the best way to get there, and you can frustrate action on it. And this is the environment to a T. I think part of it is that it's hard for people to figure out how to interpret, like, say, the scale of the disaster in Libya. And so for me, when I hear 2 dams break, I just like, I don't, and like whole communities are gone. I actually can't compute that. Like that doesn't work in my head. But I mean, the conversation that we're having around work here in Alberta today too, is that we don't know what it means to have dozens of children on dialysis because of an E. coli outbreak in a childcare facility. So even then so it's the kind of thing where I think part of the issue is that it's just, I don't know if this is a protection kind of thing or if it's just so much easier to understand when it's one person who's stuck down a well compared to we've got the scope of it makes it really hard to compute. I also think that this is an opportunity. I'll present it as an opportunity because I think it's also one of the barriers that to action and getting like policy action going on this, especially in places like Canada, where it's cold and then it's hot. And we know that we have not done transit. So like you've got to people like it's really hard to think of living your life in a way where you're not using fossil fuels like a lot. Like if people think about like heating their homes or cooling their homes or getting to and from work or to and from various sorts of things, like the way the structure makes it really hard to think about what the other options are. And in that sense, if the more reasonable options can be presented that show a fundamentally different way of doing things, the more supportive people will be. And so this is one of these things where the data show really clearly that opposition to solar, there's some work that's being done to get some really profound opposition to solar power built in places like Alberta, in particular southern Alberta, where on one hand we can say, come to southern Alberta, it's the sunniest place in Canada. And then on the other hand, say, solar power is the worst thing that we could possibly think to do. So in both of the data collections that we've done, the proportion of the sample that is like viscerally, viciously the most opposed to solar energy is the same proportion that is viscerally, viciously most opposed to nuclear. And so my spouse and I, we fight about this all the time because his like level of risk aversion for things like nuclear energy, I think are low enough that he's in the tails of the distribution. I'm like, to my spouse, I say, you are weird, that you don't seem to be bothered by both radioactive waste and also the cost associated with storing radioactive waste. Like, interesting. How did you get to this point? Because my argument would always be like, and he's like, well, if we're going to stop burning fossil fuels, we're going to have to start doing something else. And I was like, yes, but solar's so much cheaper. Like, why would we bother spending the money on a nuclear power plant when we could like put solar panel, especially here, like we'd have to worry about the hail. But in terms of like when it's not hailing, which is most of the time, it just seems like it's the easiest, cheapest solution. I will say there was one participant who got randomly selected in our first data collection into you could make a lot of money into solar treatment. And it's the only complaint I've ever gotten in my research career to the ethics board, where this individual, the argument was, this is just so stupid. Like, these scholars have offended me with their stupidity to the point where it's an ethical violation. And like, we can laugh at that, but it's also like, think about in southern Alberta, where it just does nothing, like it gets to be so sunny, it's dystopian. What's the process that would have to be underway when this is the cheapest renewable option that is readily available, that people would have to think that it was too offensive to consider? Someone's done that work.
Don't let facts get in the way of a good story about why we need a moratorium on solar and wind power. I
got to say, like, this is the rural. So part of it's just like, this is the things I say in class. Nobody asks me for advice on certifications, but if they did, I would not have gone that direction if we're talking about needing regulations for cleanup, while we're not going to talk about orphan wells, but we're going to talk about orphan solar panels that don't exist. Anyway, I will fully acknowledge that there is a regulatory space that needs to be filled, particularly with respect to like land access, land agents, how that stuff gets done with farmers. I can understand how rural Alberta would be like skeptical out of the gate on the basis of partisanship alone for any policy that was enacted under a new Democrat government. I get all of that. And even accepting all of that, the way that this moratorium on renewables projects has been presented is still indefensible from, I think, a substantive policy perspective.
I was on a panel at the Bennett Jones law firm that was co-hosted by Energy Storage Canada in June, and a questioner in the audience asked, and it was about renewable electricity and battery storage, asked if we thought, the panelists, that we should put a moratorium on the development of new renewable electricity. I said, no, that's a terrible idea, and gave sort of a few reasons for why. Obviously, I think that questioner knew something that I didn't at the time, and so I'd say if you're listening to this, please reach out to me. I'd love to hear the backstory as to how you saw that moratorium coming when no one else in the industry did. Yeah. But listen,
I mean, this is the thing that I find interesting, because it connects to this idea about the market, right? And so consistently the top predictor that we find across our data collections and across provinces about opposition to moving away from fossil fuels towards more renewable sources of energy is this idea that it's like Reaganomics, or somebody thinks that like big business making lots of money benefits everyone, including the poor, that government's got to stay out of the economy. Like, the more somebody thinks that particular economic perspective, the more they're likely to be opposed to transition. And the part that I always find really perplexing about this is that if you look at this renewables moratorium, the way that this has gone down has like made it so that lots of people who could have made like a lot of money aren't going to do that. And so even then, this is one of those things where the perception is what's driving it. And it, like, even the actual dollars of it don't seem to be upsetting this kind of narrative about these economic perceptions and things. It's fascinating. I have to say that the inconsistency and the way that this stuff doesn't square up is, for me, where the interesting stuff lands. But it's also, if anybody's frustrated in this space because it doesn't square, it's like, nah, it doesn't. This is why the perceptions matter more than the facts sometimes.
Yeah. Well, we've found it fascinating as well, and I'm sure our listeners will. So, Melanie Thomas, thanks so much. We appreciate your time, and thanks for joining us. Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Voinijescu, with help from Crystal Hickey. Our title and show music is The Wind Up by Brian Lips. This season of Energy versus Climate is produced with support from the University of Calgary's Office of the Vice President for Research and its Global Research Initiative. Further support comes from the Trache Family Foundation, the North Family Foundation, and our generous listeners. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. This helps new listeners find the show. We'll be back live September 27th, dissecting the 1.5C warming target with climate scientist Zeke Housefather. See you then.